Greetings. My name is Dr. Zebulon Maletsky. I'm the Chair of Marketing and PR for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the Executive Producer of Asala TV. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our series in Retrospect and Prospect, Topics in African American Life and History, produced, edited, and hosted by our very own Dr. Lopez Matthews, Chair of the Publications Committee for Asala. Dr. Lopez writes, in remembering Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Mary McLeod Bethune wrote the article, The Negro in Retrospect and Prospect. In this piece, she examined the past, foretold the future, and issued a challenge to the post-war informed and educated Black American citizenry. In this spirit, we speak to interesting figures in the Black community to discuss the past, the present, and what we imagine the future will hold. We hope you'll continue to join us and enjoy this series. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me, everyone. My name is Lopez Matthews, and I'm the chair of the Publications Committee for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And today I'm here with Gloria Browne-Marshall, professor at John Jay College, an executive council member on the Executive Council of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the author of She Took Justice, The Black Woman, Law, and Power, 1619 to 1969. So thank you for joining me today, Gloria.
Thank you, Lopez.
So I'll jump right into it. And the first question I have for you is, what has been the role of the law in the lives of Black women?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question because even though we live in the most litigious nation in the world, the United States has more lawyers, more judges, more lawsuits, and at the same time, we have a constitution that no one's read, yet we export it around the world. And as a constitutional law professor, as someone who's a civil rights attorney and teaches about law, but also realizes the role law plays in our oppression as well as our liberation, I just thought it was just amazing to know how many women impacted law and were impacted by law, became lawyers, and took the law to use it as a stepping stone to their aspirations and to the betterment of the African American community. And when the African American community is better, the whole world is better, because whatever we accrue in law, it now affects everybody. It benefits the whole society. And so Black women have made such an impact that I began She Took Justice with Queen Nzinga in Angola. And I visited Angola during the 400th commemoration of the 1619 arrival of the Africans into the Jamestown settlement. And that African arrival included men, women, and children. So when we think about our Adam and Eve as African Americans, then we need to go to 1619. And that doesn't say that there weren't Africans in the North American regions, and for example, St. Augustine before this, but the United States begins its history with 1607 and the Virginia colony in Jamestown settlement. So 1619, these 20 and odd Africans arrive. And so that begins in less than 20 years, our stake in this country. And that, of course, is before the Mayflower landed, because the Mayflower landed in 1620. We were here before the Mayflower. So when we think about the role of law, in 1619 was also, in July, the beginning of the legislative body called the House of Burgesses. So we have the legislative body in July of 1619, the arrival of Africans in August of 1619, and those women then are affected by law and impact the law going forward. So that's where I began my book, and that's why it's 1619 to 1969.
You know, as you were talking, it just made me think about, I read a book on the life of Judge Jane Boleyn and her impact, and they kind of focused on the role of Black women in politics and in the law. And so why do you think a lot of people don't know about the great impact that Black women have had throughout our history.
Well, so often women have been in the background in many aspects of history. We give and we support, we nurture, we advocate, we bleed and we die, just like men do, but probably more so in those areas because we're also fighters. And between Black men and Black women, we have more parity of experience, similarities in experience. We were in Africa together. We were in the Middle Passage together. We took the lash together. We worked the fields together. We were all subjected, man, woman, and child in the African American community to racial segregation under Jim Crow. We were lynched, women and children, and of course more so men, but we were all lynched during this aspect of lynching in this country in that era. So we have experienced life more together, and yet at the same time, it's rare, too often rare, to have the African American male raise up the African American woman to an understanding in history. This is not a competition. This is a battle we're all fighting shoulder to shoulder, and we need to better understand that we're stronger together. The unit is powerful when we work together, and I think that for the most of our history, we have worked together, but unfortunately, too often, men in our community don't see the woman's role as powerful as theirs. They see it as a given. And I do a lot of things, for example, and if I were a man, they would go, wow, she's brilliant, she's powerful, she's this. No, but when a woman does it, you're just busy. It's like, you're just busy. You just do a lot of things. You're all over the place, but if you're a man, it's like, oh, that's genius. That's brilliant that you're able to do all those things. But women so often have had to do so many things that it's just taken for granted that what we contribute is something we're just supposed to do. Where when men contribute it, it's amazing. So I think we need to actually look at Black women as being amazing. And so my book focuses on the amazing contributions of Black women who were suffering under all the things I've already named and still figured out a way to say that I've got to rise up with the Black man, without the Black man. And too often it's been another question, where are these white women? And usually the female experience has been one in which we should be sister to sister, shoulder to shoulder working, but I give the same argument. They too have said, yes, you contributed all of that. That's nice and well and good, but I'm going to go ahead and go forward, and I'm not going to see you as my sister in arms. And so too often the Black woman has just had to go her own way, and through that she's been strengthened and contributed, but it's time she also gets the attribution of what she's given to the world.
You said that, and it did take me back to Judge Jane Boleyn's story, because they talk about how she experienced extreme sexism in the NAACP because she was such a strong personality, and they didn't believe that women should be leaders in that way and telling men what to do. And so it makes me think about today as you have Black women sort of supporting voting rights. And I know that you are a voting rights expert. And as we talk about like Stacey Abrams in Georgia and flipping the state blue and her impact, how have Black women propelled the voting rights movement?
Well, when you even think about Judge Jane Boleyn, who was the first Black female judge in New York City, where I am, she also experienced the racism of white women when she attempted to join or was nominated to be a part of a white women's group, and they did not want her in it. She would have been the first Black woman. And it took some censorship of the organization by other white women before she was included. And this has happened in many instances in which Black women have tried again and again to be a part of white women's organizations, and then we've decided to create our own, and you see that with Ida B. Wells Barnett. And speaking of suffragettes, the suffragettes movement was started in upstate New York with Seneca Falls in 1848. And Frederick Douglass was there. He was married to a Black woman at the time, but his Black wife was not present there. And so Sojourner Truth was also in upstate New York. She was not there, and she was a suffragette, someone who was a woman fighting for the vote or the suffrage that was supposed to come with citizenship. And so, and one thing that gets me about these powerful women I'll name who have been part of the voting rights movement back when it was called the suffragettes movement was that, you know, they may not have had a platform, but they created one. And that's what the Black woman does. She makes a way out of no way. And so we have Ida B. Wells Barnett, as I've said, who started off, who, you know, known, of course, by many of us as a journalist, uncovering lynching of Black men for economic reasons and jealousy and all these other rationalizations that were later, you know, seen as the true cause of lynching of Black men, as opposed to this assault on white women, which was a lie told often enough. But you had Black women who, as I said, were writers and lecturers, and they did so many other things in addition to voting rights. And so you have women like Mary Church Terrell, you know, who in Washington, D.C., of course, was very much known as an activist and grassroots organizer, but also someone who once again attempted to join white women's organization, was rebuffed and started her own organizations. You had Louise Lasseter, who was someone who was fighting poll taxes and literacy tests. You had Black women who were doing so many things like Fannie Lou Hamer and many others. And those Black women, for example, like Ella Baker, who were organizing young people around the vote, but they were also organizing grassroots activity for other things, for the sit-ins, for example, and marching for social justice. So they were always advocating for voting rights and at the same time advocating for expansion of all those other rights as well. And of course, Paula Murray, who was a person who became a co-founder of the National Organization for Women, but she was also, once again, advocating for women's rights as well as voting rights, as well as expansion of social justice. So on and on again, you're going to have women who have been working in a number of areas, as I said, where you stay busy for doing a number of things at the same time, and we don't get this attribution. There's so many, like Gloria Richardson in Maryland, who had to advocate for voting rights in order for representation, but also had to advocate to break down racial segregation in and of itself and expand social justice. So we were always so many women, and She Took Justice speaks to just a handful of those women who have fought for their true place at the table, and not just taking crumbs from the table of justice, but actually having their voice heard. And every time they expanded rights for women, for African American communities, they're expanding rights for everyone else, because the Equal Protection Clause is for everyone. And once the Supreme Court would rule on these cases, it would expand all rights, not just rights for Black people.
So you mentioned Paula Murray. Could you explain to us the importance and impact of Paula Murray so our audience members know who she is?
Paula Murray was a lawyer who was experiencing racial segregation outside of Howard Law School when she was attending it, but she was experiencing gender bias and sexism inside Howard Law School. And so she graduated at the top of her class, and but for her gender, she would have been valedictorian. But she was denied that. And she always lived with this sense that not only is she going to be under the bind of racism, but also the bind of sexism. And that's what my book, She Took Justice, is about. That these are Black women who are fighting racism as well as sexism. They're fighting the lash like everyone else. They're fighting Jim Crow segregation, but they're also fighting within their own communities and outside of the communities. Those people who should have been allies are also people undermining her confidence and undermining her progress. And then you have a whole overlay of that, of racial segregation. And so Paula Murray is seeing all of this. And what is so wonderful about her story is that Paula Murray then goes on to not just be a civil rights attorney in Montgomery, Alabama and other places, but she also becomes a co-founder of the National Organization of Women. And she becomes the first Black female Episcopal priest. So she does a number of things, and she becomes an advisor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's cases, involving gender bias. She plays an oversized role in so many ways when it comes to the civil rights movement, as well as the gender studies and women's rights movement. So Paula Murray is someone that people should know, but she's an unsung hero. Because as I said before, so many times Black women have had to juggle so many balls, and yet we're seen as, you know, somebody who's a master of none when it comes to how many things that we could do, you know, but we become not just masters, but mistresses of our own destinies. And so too often that destiny is not given the same credence and importance in historical landscape as that of Black men. And so when we look at the civil rights movement, even the March on Washington, when we see the men speaking, there were many Black women who were very important to the organizing, like Mary Hamilton in Washington, D.C., and her case is in my book, and many others, and they're not allowed to speak. Only the men are allowed to speak. And so it was thought that, you know, Black women should take a back seat and let the males speak because of the male ego and, you know, the need for men to bring, you know, that male power to the forefront, with the idea that any moment now they're going to call the sisters up and say, yes, you know, we know that you've done all this work. But unfortunately, too often the Black men were not speaking up on behalf of Black women. When Black women speak, we speak for the whole community and we speak for our men. But when Black men speak, too often it's with the idea that they understand racism, but for some reason they don't seem to understand sexism. And my concern is we can't go forward if there is no understanding of sexism. So if you understand that their law and custom can prevent people of color from moving forward because we are of African descent, then why not understand that law and custom can prevent women from moving forward because of what they've been learned, what they've learned through the years of how women and the place of women, and the fact that Black women are making 80 cents on the dollar of a white male. And so it really disturbs the people back then, but it was thought that, you know, we're going to step back and let the man speak first and let them lead. Some people think biblically the male is supposed to lead. Other people think that it's just a very important thing for our community. But at some point we have to say, when is the Black man going to recognize the power and the contribution of the Black woman so that we can go forward together and do more?
You know, I'm glad you brought that up. It takes me, I always say your comments take me to other things, but it makes me think about Joanne Gibson Robinson. She wrote a book, The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. And she talks about how they brought Martin Luther King down there to be the face of their movement because they knew that no one would follow women. And so it's interesting just kind of seeing how women have adapted over the years, Black women to be more specific, have adapted over the years to achieve success, especially in the civil rights movement and voting rights. And so how do you see that same thing playing out today as you look at our fight for voting rights and to ensure our voting rights today, especially in this tumultuous political year?
Well, it was understood that Black women made the difference in this political climate. It was understood they would make the difference, and that without Black women, Joe Biden would not have won. But let's just talk about how powerful the Black vote has always been. This is not only the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, it's also the 150th anniversary of the year 1870, when Black men gained the right to vote with the passage of the 15th Amendment. And so as soon as Black men gained the right to vote, and our first Black U.S. Senator was Hiram Revels in 1870, we had over 4,000 Black men in Congress, state, local, and federal offices, in political positions across the country, to the highest level of lieutenant governor. We had all of these Black men in these positions, and we had the Black women working to gain their right to vote with the suffragettes movement at the same time. So Black women were grassroots organizers back during that time period. So when we're looking at the power of the Black vote, it was understood even then it could change the outcome of an election. And that's why we had in 1890 the Mississippi Plan. And this is all in my book, The Voting Rights War. And so, yes, so when I speak about the voting rights movement, the voting rights war has always been a war. It's always been one battle as election at a time, battle after battle. So here now we have in 1890, the Mississippi Plan, in which we have Vardaman, who comes up with this speech in which he says, this is not about the vote, this is about the N-word and getting that person out of politics. That's why they come up with the grandfather clause and the literacy test and the poll taxes, specifically to stop the power of the Black vote. And in my book, The Voting Rights War, I show that in 1890, when they have this speech about the Mississippi Plan and how to stop the Black vote, there were over 100,000 Black men in Louisiana. And this is Louisiana's particular in my book because it was Louisiana, which is the site of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. Plessy versus Ferguson, as you know, then has apartheid become the law of the land with a separate but equal doctrine. And that's 1896. By 1900, there are about 5,000 Black registered voters in Louisiana. This decision by the Supreme Court is open season on Black people. It's understood that to stop the Black vote is to stop Black power and to stop Black progress. And that's why they go for the Black vote. So when we get to 1909 with the NAACP, one of the major components is the vote. And so that is one of their major platforms, is the vote. And then the first case that's successful before the U.S. Supreme Court is U.S. versus Gwynne, which is a voting rights case that then finds that grandfather clauses are unconstitutional in 1915. So these fights, these battles, these contests have been taking place up to this point where from the poll tax, the literacy test, all these things are being challenged again and again, the white only primaries in Texas. And so by the time we get to what do you have now as voter suppression, we have a civil death, which is the felony convictions that are undermining the right of people to vote if they have been formally convicted with a felony. We have the lack of voting machines. We have long lines. We have all these deterrents put in place like photo IDs. And so Stacey Abrams and other Black women were in the forefront and in the forefront of making sure that despite voter suppression, you had great voter outcomes. And that took hard work. And that took Black women because that grassroots organizing that began in the 1800s had never stopped. So when Black women gained the right to vote in 1920, with all women, the problem then becomes the attacks on Black women. So at the same time, you have an increased criminalization of the Black woman as she gains political power and attacks and rapes of Black women. And so you see today, the Black women are pushing, Black women are at the forefront. Without the Black vote, Joe Biden would not have won. That's how pivotal the Black vote remains. And you see the continuous attacks on Black women as well.
So speaking of the continuous attacks on Black women, it makes me think of, especially this election, Kamala Harris and her election as vice president. The first Black woman, first Asian American woman. She has a lot of firsts in her election. And so what do you think the impact of that is going to mean for other Black women?
I think it's a powerful impact. And that's why there's been this ongoing madness from the White House to delay the transition. Because, you know, to have Kamala Harris, a Black woman, as vice president is history, as you've named it, on so many different levels, but it also empowers other generations to come forward and take their rightful place in this political spectrum. It empowers them to rise up in so many other areas. And just like Barack Obama's, you know, historic moment as a two-term Black president, it sets the stage for more at a time period that we know by 2045, this country is going to be majority people of color. And so what's happening from the conservative standpoint is the anchoring of apartheid. This is my professional opinion, that apartheid is thought, of course, you know, as minority rule, as thought to be necessary, but it requires a political component. It requires the undermining of the votes of people of color, in addition to the limiting of the populations of people of color. And so we're coming to a loggerhead, a conflict of sorts that she represents. As a woman, she gives birth. And this is what we thought of when I was writing this book, when I talked to people about She Took Justice and how the Black woman's body created America. Because it's the Black woman's body that gave birth to the labor force that becomes the engine that creates America on Native American stolen land. And so now we have the Black woman once again as the beauty of her giving birth to the movement of Black power, and that Black power movement going forward. Not so much that Kamala Harris herself is someone who is a believer in the Black power movement, is beyond her. It's beyond any of us individually. And what we need to understand is, Lopez, for us to be together and for anybody watching this of African descent to even be here is a miracle. Our presence is a miracle. And it's in this miracle that we've, for 400 years gone through all we've gone through and able to still be here means that for us to go through for another 400 years, we need to not only have learned from what we gained from 400 years of perseverance, but to also realize that there are people who understand our power and will stop us and will do whatever it takes to keep us from progressing. And so we need to always be vigilant and understand from what we've learned in the past and where we're going in the future. Kamala Harris represents a touchstone on that, as did Barack Obama. But there are so many more Kamala Harrises and so many more Barack Obamas. To us, that's a great achievement. To us, that's something powerful to look for in the future. To others, it's a serious concern. And if we are not going to be wise, if we're going to be historians who believe history is something in a history book, but it's not real, then we need to really shake ourselves. History is real. It's not something that you just use to gain tenure or to teach in class and get paid. History is a roadmap that tells you the extent by which people will stop us from our progress. And so each time we see progress like Kamala Harris, we need to be expecting the backlash, because African American and American history writ large says we go 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So Kamala Harris represents so much the Black woman has attained, but it also means there's a target on the Black woman's back. And we need to understand that there will be people who will try to stop and undermine our progress going forward because she represents so much.
One of the things, we've talked about your book a bit and you've referenced it, but I really want to ask you, how do you share the story of Black women in your book?
I use true stories because the law is based in the facts of what happened. The interpretation of those facts can change from person to person, but the facts are there. And so many of the cases I use were written for the stance, I guess, that Black folks would never learn to read. So they're pretty much in your face. They give you the blunt truth. And so these are true stories of Black women who have challenged the law, who have been crushed by the law, who have died by the law, who have challenged not just the law itself, but the lawmakers, in small places in the highest courts. And so I start with Queen Nzinga. I end with Shirley Chisholm, when she rises up to become the first Black woman congressperson. And so when I start my next book, which is about the rise of the Black woman into power, I go from 1970 to present. And so once again, it's following true stories. So every woman in this book, She Took Justice, lived. And her role and the impact on her of the law and the way she impacted law, I think will be fascinating for any reader. And there will be people you know about, but you don't know that Sojourner Truth brought 4 different lawsuits. 4 different lawsuits, yes, and won them all. It's like back in the 1800s. So I want people to understand the role of Queen Nzinga. I want them to see what Black women were doing and how they made life better for all of us. And so that's why I just wrote this book, and these women now are going forward into the world, and you can read about their contributions and give them the attribution they deserve, from Gloria Richardson moving that bayonet away from her face that becomes this iconic, image, and all the way through to the women. And I start the book off with a reference to Kamala Harris and Michelle Obama, who of course is also a lawyer.
Well, thank you for that. I want to just ask you one final question, and that is, what do you want people to take away from this conversation about Black women in law and justice?
When I went to law school, it was a very tumultuous time for me in my personal life. And I wondered, did I make a mistake going to law school? Was this the right thing for me? Until I took my labor law class. And then I took a civil rights class and a gender studies class. And I realized that law has been used so often as a tool of oppression, but it's also a tool of liberation. And then as a writer, I learned that law is also storytelling, because you have human conflict, you have the facts laid out, and you have the request of the courts to help figure out how we go forward. And so law has meant so many things to me as a civil rights attorney, as a professor of constitutional law, as someone who tries to bridge the gap in my nonprofit organization, the Law and Policy Group. All these ways in which I believe that law should be seen not just as something that's cold and this one party versus another, but it contains a whole way of looking at the world, from philosophy and the practicality of law, but also to the true stories of human endeavor. And so I'm hoping that my book, She Took Justice, and my other books as well, are written in an accessible way that anybody can see law now as something more than something that we just look at from a standpoint of just a conflict between parties, to a conflict and as deep as any other storytelling could be.
It's wonderful. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And I hope that everyone who is watching has learned something from this great conversation. And so thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Lopez.